Right now, in the quiet depth of the night, an old memory may have caught you like a sharp splinter hidden in the bedding. You are lying perfectly still, but inside your thoughts are frantically working. Picking at a specific choice, a word spoken years ago, or a path you wish you had never walked. There is a deep internal exhaustion that comes from turning your own history into a courtroom where you are always the executioner, using your past mistakes as an emotional weapon to punish yourself in the dark. You are replaying the scenes, trying desperately to unpick a knot that time has already beaten down flat into the fabric of your life. If you feel this heavy ache in your chest tonight, please know that you are not broken, and what you are experiencing is not a permanent failure. Tonight, we will not force your mind to be instantly silent, nor will we try to erase your history instead. We are going to explore how to stop tearing apart the foundation of your present life just to alter an inch of the past that has already been locked into place. The mind does not find its freedom because you have finally rewritten your history, but because you have stopped using yesterday to destroy today. True peace arrives when you realize the surprising truth that self-forgiveness does not begin when the old mistake disappears from your memory. It begins when you stop using that mistake as a tool to torture your current self. Trying to unweave a finished choice is like a master weaver using a sharp iron needle to rip out a coarse pressed deep into the lower base of an old cloth. The frantic picking does not change the design. It only makes your fingers bleed, frays the thread, and threatens to unravel the beautiful, unwritten fabric you are supposed to be weaving right now. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight, dear friend, and you do not need to repair every broken thread before morning. You are safe enough to soften right where you are, allowing the loom of your mind to rest in the shadow. Let your awareness slow down, drifting away from the heavy courtrooms of regret and settling into the immediate physical texture of your room. Notice the cool, subtle draft that moves across the floorboards, a quiet contrast to the dense warmth of the heavy wool covers over your chest. The dim light in your room is soft, casting long, unhurried amber shadows against the walls, much like the flickering glow of a single tallow candle after the wick has been trimmed. The air you are breathing carries a faint, clean crispness, a scent of cold night air and quiet earth that requires no justification from you. Your body is resting heavily against the pillow, its shape supported entirely by the mattress below, asking for no display of correctness, no defense of your past, and no proof of your goodness in this space. The darkness is not an empty void, it is a gentle sanctuary that conceals you from every expectation you have spent the day trying to meet, especially your own. For so many years, you may have believed that your guilt is a necessary form of discipline, that if you punish yourself severely enough for an old failure, you can somehow balance the cosmic ledger or prevent yourself from falling again. We often treat our spirits like an imperfect piece of cloth, pulling violently at every uneven ridge, every loose fiber, and every organic knot until the whole structure feels thin, brittle, and ready to tear. But this constant tearing leaves the heart feeling raw and permanently exposed, living in a state of hypervigilance where every memory becomes a trap. Tonight, you can let the iron needle drop. The choices you made yesterday were made by a person who was operating under different conditions, carried by old fears, and lacking the clarity you possess right now. To continuously punish the person sitting here in the dark for a ghost's action is an injustice to your own changing nature. If it feels right, take a slow breath in, noticing how the air fills the lower spaces of your chest, and let it go without trying to regulate its path or achieve a perfect stillness. You do not need to force anything to change right now. Even noticing the sharp texture of your regrets is enough to begin a softer relationship with them. When we stop demanding that our history be flawless, a subtle, beautiful space begins to open within our awareness. We step down from the judge's bench and become the quiet, unhurried witness of the evening, allowing the threads of our life to exist exactly as they fell. In a moment, this journey will take us deeper into the upland hills, showing us how a young craftsman learned to live with a ruined garment without destroying his hands. But before we journey there, let your thoughts rest on the nature of a woven blanket that has survived a long winter. The blanket is not precious because every single thread is perfectly straight and uniform. It is warm because the wool is thick, because the fibers have interlocked through friction, and because the knots hold the structure together. Your life possesses that same durable dignity tonight. The uneven ridges you are trying so hard to unpick are the very places where your resilience was formed, the weathered patterns that make your presence real, heavy, and true. As you lie here, letting the heavy rhythm of your breath deepen, let your imagination guide you toward a narrow, winding path made of grey mountain stones and dry earth. The path is cool, bordered by tall, wild grasses that brush softly against your ankles as you walk away from the crowded valleys of human judgment. The air up here is thin and clean, smelling deeply of damp pine needles, wild mountain thyme, and the pungent, fermented sweetness of old indigo vats baking slowly in the valley below. There are no signs here marking your progress, no voices reminding you of past failures, and no eyes watching to see if your stride is perfect. There is only the pale silver glow of a low autumn moon filtering through the mountain mist, casting a soft glaze over the rough landscape. As you walk further up this steep terrace, the frantic, defensive pacing of your daily self-criticism begins to slow down, adapting naturally to the heavy, unhurried breath of the mountain itself. Every step away from the world of regret is a step back into your own skin, a gentle retrieval of the spirit you have left, scattered across the years. The cold fog hangs low over the upland farming plots, moving like soft white wool, softening the sharp edges of the stone walls, just as the night is softening the sharp edges of your memories. Further up the ridge, tucked into a drafty hollow, where the upland wind sweeps across the barley fields, sits a small rustic timber workshop. The setting is profoundly simple, defined by the low, rhythmic clack-thud of a heavy wooden heddle moving inside a loom somewhere in the dark. It is here, surrounded by the scent of raw lanolin, unrefined hemp and cold timber, that we find a safe harbor from the relentless drive to repair the past. You are invited to sit down on a low wooden bench at the edge of this workshop, wrapped in a coarse, heavy indigo cloak that feels rough and reassuring against your skin. Nothing is required of you. Here there is no mistake to undo, no old relationship to repair, and no self-punishment to complete. You are simply a quiet awareness, resting in the tallow light, listening to the ancient, steady heartbeat of a world that knows exactly how to hold what is finished. The upland wind that rattles the loose cedar shingles of the workshop carries the distinct, sharp bite of early winter. Inside, the dim space is illuminated only by two low tallow candles, their yellowish flames dancing unevenly in the draught, casting long shivering shadows across piles of unspun fleece and hanks of dark, indigodied yarn. In this quiet, unhurried atmosphere, the rhythmic movement of the mountain begins to reveal a story that has been preserved for generations, a story that speaks directly to the pattern of your own midnight thoughts. Many years ago, in an isolated village perched on these high farming terraces, there lived a young weaver named Yuto. He was an exceptionally careful craftsman, possessing a rare sensitivity for the weight of wool and the precise alignment of threads. Yet, despite his talent, Yuto lived in a state of constant internal torment. Months before, he had been chosen to weave a sacred ceremonial robe for the village elder, a task of immense honor. During the final days of weaving, his mind had wandered for a brief second, and his shuttle had skipped a single thread in the hidden lower hem of the garment. To an ordinary person, the mistake was completely invisible, buried beneath the dense texture of the indigo wool. But to Yuto, that tiny skipped thread became a catastrophic failure, a permanent stain on his character that proved he was a fraud. From that night onward, the memory of that single split-second mistake became an emotional weapon. Whenever he sat down at his loom, the thought would return, striking his chest like a cold needle. He stopped sleeping, spending his midnights sitting on the dirt floor of his hut, turning his history over and over in his mind, wishing with a desperate, burning intensity that he could reach back into time and correct that single throw of the wooden shuttle. He began to look at everything he created through the lens of that one failure, convincing himself that, because his past was flawed, his present hands were entirely unworthy of trust. One dark evening, unable to bear the loud replaying arguments inside his own head, Yuto took a beautifully thick indigodied wool coverlet that he had recently finished. It was a magnificent piece of work, heavy with raw lanolin and dyed 7 times in the pungent, fermented indigo vats until it held the color of the deep ocean at night. He spread it out beneath his sputtering tallow candle, took a long, sharp iron needle, and began to dig into the lower hem, where a small natural knot of wool had been beaten down into the foundation. He told himself that if he could just straighten this one knot, if he could make this one piece perfectly uniform, the gnawing regret inside his heart would finally fall silent. With trembling fingers, he drove the iron needle into the tightly interlocked fibers. He picked and pulled at the thread, trying to force the wool to yield, trying to unweave what the loom had already finalized. But the wool was stubborn, its microscopic scales locked together by friction and time. The harder he pried with the iron needle, the more the fiber resisted. Within an hour, his fingers were bleeding from the rough friction of the unrefined thread. He had not straightened the knot instead. He had frayed the yarn into a chaotic, fuzzy mass, snapping several crucial warp threads and leaving a gaping, ruined wound right in the center of the beautiful coverlet. The cloth was now truly ruined, not by the original irregularity of the loom, but by his own frantic, desperate attempt to rewrite its foundation. Horrified by what his obsession had done, Yuto gathered the damaged indigo cloth against his chest and walked out into the freezing mountain night. He climbed the steep, rock-strewn path that led to the highest terrace, where an elderly master weaver named Ren lived in a drafty timber shelter. Master Ren was a man who spent his life working with the roughest materials. His skin stained a permanent light blue from the indigo dye, his eyes calm and wide like the mountain sky. When Yuto burst through the heavy wooden door, his face wet with tears of exhaustion, he threw the frayed cloth onto the floorboards between them. "Master Ren," Yuto cried, his voice breaking against the howling wind outside. "Look at what I have done. I am a ruined craftsman. I cannot stop picking at my own work. I spent the entire night trying to remove a single organic knot from this hem, and my iron needle has only torn the fabric apart. I am plagued by every mistake I have ever made, and the more I try to fix my past, the more my present life unravels in my hands. Why is my mind so unmerciful to itself?" In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, revealing the simple demonstration that began to shift Yuto's understanding of his own pain. Master Ren did not pick up the frayed indigo coverlet, nor did he offer words of pity or philosophical reassurance. He remained seated on his low wooden bench, his large, blue-stained hands resting calmly on his knees. He allowed the silence of the room to breathe, filled only by the rhythmic whistling of the wind through the timber gaps and the steady, heavy rise and fall of Yuto's chest. The tallow candle flickered, casting a warm glow over the raw, unrefined wool that filled the corners of the workshop. Slowly, the old man reached out and picked up the long iron needle that Yuto had dropped on the floor. He held the cold metal up to the candlelight, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. Then, he pointed toward a large, upright wooden loom that stood in the center of the dark workshop. where a new piece of coarse grey cloth was currently being formed. Come here, Yuto, Master Ren said, his voice low and steady, carrying the natural weight of the mountain earth. Sit beside me on the bench. Yuto moved forward, his shoulders curved, his hands still raw and stinging from the friction of the coarse yarn. He sat on the rough cedar wood, looking at the complex grid of threads stretched tightly between the heavy timber beams of the loom. Look at this warp, Ren said, touching the vertical threads that form the skeleton of the fabric. When we weave, the wooden shuttle glides between these lines, carrying the wet wool back and forth, and after every single pass we take this heavy wooden bar, the heddle, and we slam it downward against the new thread. Clack-thud. We beat it down with the full weight of our arms, pressing the fiber tight into the layers that came before it. Once that wooden bar has struck, Yuto, the thread no longer belongs to your hands. It belongs to the cloth. It becomes part of the density, part of the memory, part of the weight of the entire piece. Ren took the sharp iron needle and approached the tightly beaten grey cloth on his loom. He placed the sharp point against a thick, uneven ridge in the woven rows. Watch closely, he whispered. The old man pushed the needle into the weave, attempting to pull a single thread backward out of the tight structure. He applied a small amount of pressure, and immediately the surrounding threads began to bunch up, the vertical warp lines warping and groaning under the unnatural strain. A sharp, tearing sound echoed in the quiet room as the needle began to shred the neighboring fibers. Ren stopped, removing the needle, leaving a small, distorted patch of fuzz where the clean grid had been. Do you see this? Ren asked, returning to the bench. This iron needle is the judgment of your overthinking mind. Every time you lie awake at night, replaying your old failures, you are driving this needle into a fabric that the wooden loom of time has already beaten down flat. The choice you made months ago was struck by the heddle of reality. It has already been pressed into the lower base of your life, interlocking with 1,000 other threads: your fears at that time, your lack of clarity, your exhaustion, and the conditions of that forgotten moment. The old man touched the frayed, ruined wound on Yuto's indigo coverlet. Your suffering does not come from the small knot that fell into the cloth months ago. Yuto, your suffering comes because you cannot stop driving this iron needle into your own skin, demanding that the past change its shape. You are tearing your hands apart, breaking the threads of your present day, all to straighten an inch of yarn that has already been woven into the dark earth. Tell me, young weaver, how can you create a beautiful tomorrow when your fingers are constantly bleeding from trying to tear apart yesterday? Yuto looked at the distorted fuzz on Master Ren's loom and then down at his own wounded fingers. A profound stillness settled into his chest, a sudden heavy recognition that ran deeper than any intellectual answer. He saw that his chronic guilt was not a form of wisdom or discipline. It was a violent refusal to accept the movement of time. He had been treating his life like an unwritten draft that he could endlessly correct, failing to see that the beauty of the cloth was not found in an absence of knots, but in the willingness to let the shuttle fly forward onto the next clean row. Let the quiet weight of Master Ren's workshop settle into the deep corners of your awareness, much like the heavy mountain mist that gathers outside the cedar shingles. The sharp clack-thud of the wooden heddle has ended, and the long iron needle lies completely still on the table, its silver edge no longer tearing at the threads. The realization that washed over the young weaver Yuto as he looked at his bleeding fingers is an exact mirror for the private tribunals we hold inside our own minds during the darkest hours of the night. The knot he was desperately trying to extract had already been pressed flat into the lower layers of the cloth, locked by the momentum of a moment that had completely passed, yet his hands remained tense from fighting reality. He was waging a war against a finished design, harming his own flesh to alter an inch of wool that time had already woven into the earth. Maybe you have felt this exact friction too, as you lie completely still beneath your covers while the night wind moves softly through your room. You are resting in the present, but your spirit is miles away, wandering through the lower layers of your own history, picking at an old relationship that failed, a career decision that brought regret, or a mistake that caused pain to someone you cared about. We carry these old memories like Yuto carried his ruined indigo coverlet, believing that our chronic guilt is a form of correction, that if we review our failures with enough severity, we can somehow unweave the choice and restore a flawless fabric to our lives. We mistake the relentless picking of our self-criticism for a noble pursuit of goodness. But this story is not telling us to stop feeling, nor is it asking us to become cold, unfeeling, or indifferent to the choices we have made in our past. It is showing us something much quieter, a path of profound self-forgiveness that begins when we stop confusing accountability with self-destruction. The deep desire to have acted with perfect wisdom is born from a natural, beautiful longing for wholeness. But when that longing turns into a rigid demand for a flawless history, it transforms our memories into a house of mirrors. We turn our own minds into a relentless workshop, where the sharp needle of our judgment is constantly driven into our own skin, tearing apart the day we are living right now to fix a thread that has already been bound by the loom. In the timeless tradition of Buddhist wisdom, we look at this tight, picking habit of the mind not as a permanent defect of your character, but as a deep misunderstanding of how time moves. When we speak of attachment or craving in modern emotional language, we are not talking about a healthy desire to learn from our errors. We are describing that sharp, defensive restriction in the center of your chest that whispers, "If my past contains this mistake, if I cannot erase this specific failure, or if I cannot prove my innocence to my own memory, I am fundamentally unworthy of peace." This is the overthinking mind demanding that the finished rows of the cloth unpick themselves, refusing to accept that life can only be lived on the unwritten edge of the next forward throw of the shuttle. Slowly, as the tallow candles burn down in the drafty room, this ancient teaching comes closer to your own life, reaching down into the immediate, quiet space of your bedroom. It invites you to see that the immense exhaustion you are carrying tonight was not caused solely by the mistake you made years ago. The true suffering grew from the way your mind has held that mistake ever since. It grows from the exhausting habit of treating an old choice as a permanent definition of who you are, driving the iron needle of your judgment into the same sensitive wound, night after night, wondering why the fabric of your spirit feels so frayed and brittle. In a moment, this journey will take us to an even quieter place, revealing an inner practice that can help you finally drop the needle of self-blame. But before we explore that space, let us understand the profound insight the Buddha offered regarding the nature of our pain. He pointed out that in every human journey, there are always two distinct types of wounds. The first wound is simply what life brings through our own human limitations, the skipped thread, the clumsy choice made in a state of confusion, the painful words spoken when we were carried by fear or exhaustion. This is the first pain. It is like the natural knot that falls into the raw wool or the rain that dampens the fleece. We cannot always prevent this first pain, because we cannot live with perfect clarity every second of our lives. The person you were when you made that old mistake was acting from a collection of past conditions, limited perspectives, and unmet needs that you may not even fully remember tonight. The second wound, however, is entirely what our own mind adds to the original sorrow through resistance and persistent self-hatred. The first pain is the regret of a mistaken choice. The second pain is the hours of midnight, overthinking, where you turn that choice into a weapon, convincing yourself that because you failed once, you are fundamentally broken and unqualified for love. The first pain is a knot in the lower hem. The second pain is the ragged, chaotic tear you create in your present life by refusing to let the cloth rest as it fell. The Buddha was not asking us to deny our history. He was showing us how to stop feeding this second pain, how to allow the heddle of reality to strike, without turning the aftermath into a lifelong prison sentence. True mindfulness, within this textured world of threads and looms, is simply the spacious capacity to notice the sharp edge of your regrets without allowing them to command your body. It is the ability to lie still in the dark and watch an old memory arise, recognizing its heavy indigo color without picking at its fibers with a tense mind. When you practice this soft awareness, you realize that you are the vast, steady loom that holds the entire fabric, not the tiny, irregular knot that occurred 10 rows below. You see that your chronic guilt does not repair the past. It only ensures that your present hands are too wounded, too shaky, and too exhausted to weave a beautiful pattern for the day that is waiting for you tomorrow. Impermanence reminds us that the person who made that mistake years ago no longer exists within the immediate boundary of this room. You are not a static monument carved in stone. You are a fluid, changing movement of consciousness, a web of energy that is being recreated with every single breath you take, to continuously punish the person sitting here in the dark. For a ghost's action is to mistake a passing cloud for the permanent sky. The thread has already been pressed deep into the density of the cloth, and its texture has been absorbed by the weight of the entire piece. Forgiveness is not an endorsement of the error, and it is not a pretense that the thread did not skip it, is simply the honest, compassionate recognition that the strike of the heddle is final, and that the only space where your life can actually breathe is in the empty, unwritten row right beneath your chin. Right now. As you listen to the low, steady rise and fall of your chest, notice if your overthinking mind is trying to turn this teaching into another standard of perfection to meet. You might find yourself feeling anxious because you cannot let go instantly, or judging yourself because the old memory still carries a sharp sting. If that pattern is happening, let that judgment drop into the shadow too. Even that self-blame is just the mind's old habit, trying to use force to manufacture peace. You do not need to master this wisdom perfectly tonight to be permitted to rest. The rough timber loom does not apologize for its creaks, and the raw wool does not pretend to be smooth like silk. Your life is allowed to contain its uneven ridges, its knots and its skipped threads, resting fully in the quiet dark that asks for no corrections and requires no defense. Let the lingering scent of old timber and raw indigo wool drift slowly into the background of your consciousness, allowing the vast, cool silence of the mountain terrace to settle directly into the perimeter of your own bedroom. The imagery of Master Ren's heavy wooden loom does not ask you to change your position, nor does it require you to immediately heal the ancient wounds of your history. It is simply an invitation to notice what your mind has been doing with its own invisible strength while you have been lying here in the dark. If it feels right, let your attention move away from the mountain valley of the story and find the immediate, physical boundary of your own bed, discovering the deep, unquestioning support of the surface beneath your frame. Feel how the mattress bears the full weight of your body without asking for an explanation of your past choices, requiring no posture of correctness, no defense against your old failures, and no vigilant guard against the night. Take a slow, unhurried breath in, letting the crisp air travel fully into the lower spaces of your chest, and as you let it go, notice if you can invite your shoulders to drop just a small fraction deeper into the fabric of your sheets. There is no need to force a sudden, perfect state of relaxation. The simple act of recognizing where your body has been holding its armor is itself a beautiful form of medicine. If your jaw is tight from hours of replaying old conversations, or if your forehead carries the strain of trying to calculate a flawless future, Simply permit that tightness to exist, without judging it as another defect to correct. Perhaps you might tell those tired, vigilant muscles that their work for the day is entirely finished, and that the unwritten hours of the night can carry themselves without your constant management. Right now, as the silence of the room becomes wider and heavier, you might notice one specific memory, one particular word spoken in error, or one ongoing regret that has been asking persistently for your emotional energy. It might be an old relational failure that still makes your chest contract with guilt, a choice that altered your life path in a way you wish you could undo, or a deep sense of shame regarding a past version of yourself that you find difficult to look at. Instead of trying to push this thought away in anger, and instead of following its thread down into a long, circular argument where you are always the guilty party, just allow the memory to appear before your awareness. You do not need to fight it, and you do not need to solve it, you only need to let it be seen. If it feels right, you might give this internal pattern a soft, spacious name, saying to yourself quietly, "Ah, there is the old iron needle of self-blame trying to unpick the cloth." Giving the pattern a name creates a gentle, protective distance between who you are and what you are remembering. You begin to discover that you are the vast, silent loom that holds the entire fabric of your life, and this sharp regret is merely a single uneven ridge woven into a row that passed long ago. Now, inside the safe sanctuary of your imagination, you might picture your current mind as a heavy, textured indigo coverlet resting over your lap. Look down through the layers of the weave and find that one specific organic knot from your past that has been causing your thoughts so much distress. Notice how tightly the microfibers are locked together, held flat by the heavy strike of time's heddle. Instead of driving your sharp iron needle into those fibers to rip them apart, imagine gently opening your fingers and letting that needle drop out of your hands completely. Watch it fall into the shadow beneath your bench, its silver edge no longer prying at your skin, its sharp point no longer threatening to tear your present day to pieces. Let your hands lie completely flat and empty upon your lap or by your side, resting against the coarse, comforting grain of the indigo wool. As you leave that old knot undisturbed in the lower layers of the cloth, a subtle change begins to happen within the internal scenery of your mind. The fibers around the irregularity stop bunching up in defensive tension. Without the constant prying of your self-criticism, the yarn begins to soften, expanding slightly into the rows that surround it, losing its sharp, rigid boundaries and becoming part of the overall warmth and density of the blanket. The uneven ridge is no longer an isolated mistake that ruins the design, it is simply a heavy, honest detail of the weave, absorbing the quiet air of the evening, blending naturally into the larger story of how you survived the winter. In a moment, this internal softening will guide us to a second, even deeper understanding of our unfinished threads, revealing how an entirely different kind of beauty can emerge from our irregularities. But for now, let your awareness rest fully on the unwritten, empty row of the present moment. You can imagine the inhalation as the wooden shuttle gliding smoothly to the left, carrying a clean thread through the open lines of your awareness, and the exhalation as the shuttle drifting back to the right, leaving a soft trail of peace behind it. There is no heavy wooden bar slamming down to judge your progress, no frantic pacing to maintain, and no pressure to weave a flawless masterpiece before morning. You are permitted to let the shuttle rest, allowing the loom of your mind to sit empty and unadorned in the dark. Take another slow, natural breath, letting your abdomen rise and fall without trying to force your body to match any perfect standard of meditation. If your thoughts try to slip back down into the lower rows of the cloth, if they attempt to pick up the iron needle again because the quiet space feels unfamiliar or unsafe, meet that movement with an absolute, soft patience. The overthinking mind has been conditioned for many years to believe that its self-punishment is a form of protection, and it takes time for the hands to learn how to remain open and still in the dark. Whenever you notice your thoughts wandering back into the courtrooms of regret, you do not need to blame yourself for the wandering. Simply recognize the fear that drives the habit. Thank your mind for its clumsy attempt to keep you safe, and then, whenever you are ready, return your awareness to the heavy sensation of your limbs resting against your bed. Nothing is required of you now. You are not on a stage. You are not being evaluated by your memory, and there is no ledger keeping track of how deeply you are relaxing. You are completely anonymous in the dark, a simple human presence breathing in a quiet room, allowed to be as unpolished, as tired, and as rough-edged as an unrefined fiber resting in a basket. The world outside your window will continue to move and change through its own seasons without your direction, and you can trust your life to unfold without your constant anxiety. Allow yourself to sink deeper into this ground of absolute allowance, feeling steadier, softer, and more spacious with every slow release of your breath, knowing that the foundation of your being has never needed to be perfect to be worthy of this rest. The deep stillness that followed the dropping of the iron needle remained with Yuto as he climbed even higher into the rugged mountain peaks the following morning. The gentle grey terraces of Master Ren's workshop gradually fell away, replaced by steep, narrow crags where the pine trees grew sparse and the air tasted of pure, biting frost. He was travelling toward the highest ridge, where the wind never fully ceased its howling, carrying an ancient longing across the stones. Although his fingers had stopped their frantic picking at the indigo cloth, his inner world was still caught in a quiet, defensive tremor. The old habit of his mind was looking for a new arena to conquer, still whispering that somewhere, deep within his history, an unpardonable mistake remained that required his constant anxiety to correct. At the very edge of the tree line, sheltered against a sheer granite wall, stood a small, stone-walled hut with an old thatch roof weighted down by heavy river rocks to keep it from blowing away in the winter gales. This was the home of Auntie Chio, a village grandmother who had spent her entire life spinning the coarse, wild hemp fibers that grew in the rocky ravines. She was a woman who spoke less with her tongue and more with the steady, unhurried movements of her calloused thumbs. When Yuto pushed open the heavy wattled door, the air inside smelled deeply of green plant stalks, drying moss, and the pungent, unrefined oil used to lubricate the ancient wooden axles of her spinning tools. In the dim light of a low tallow candle, Auntie Chio sat on a woven straw mat, holding a heavy-weighted clay hand spindle. Between her fingers, she held a rough bundle of uncombed hemp stalks. With a practiced twist of her wrist, she sent the clay weight spinning, whirring softly as it dangled just above the floorboards, drawing out the raw fibers and twisting them into a continuous length of yarn. Yuto sat quietly in the corner, his back pressed against the cold stone wall, watching her work breathe in the small space. But the deeper lesson had not yet revealed itself, and as Yuto watched the yarn lengthen, an old, painful restriction began to tighten inside his chest once more. His eyes, trained to look for absolute precision, immediately noticed the irregular quality of the yarn she was producing. Because the wild hemp was coarse and uncultivated, the thread was filled with massive imperfections. There were thick, bulky slubs where the fibers clumped together, followed immediately by thin, frayed sections that looked as though they would snap under the slightest tension. There were rough, protruding, woody fragments of the plant casing still embedded in the twist, making the yarn look uneven, clumsy, and entirely unrefined. Yuto felt a familiar panic rising within his throat, the exact same judgment that woke him up at midnight to review his own life. He could not keep his mind from criticizing her work. He leaned forward, his hands trembling as his old programming took command. "Auntie," he said, his voice carrying the sharp, urgent edge of his inner struggle. "Please stop for a moment. Look at what your hands are doing. Your yarn is completely uneven. There are bulky knots in one turn and fragile gaps in the next. If you try to weave this into a garment, the pattern will be distorted, the surface will be rough to the touch, and the cloth will fail. Why do you not stop and pull the fibers apart, to make every inch as smooth and uniform as silk?" Auntie Chio did not stop the spindle. She allowed the clay weight to finish its spinning cycle, wearing down into an absolute silence against the floorboards. She looked up at the young weaver, her face etched with the soft, deep lines of a person who had watched 80 winters pass over the peaks. She did not defend her craft, nor did she react with anger to his criticism. She simply reached into a wooden basket beside her and pulled out a small wooden hand loom, upon which a hull-finished piece of coarse winter cloth was already stretched. In a moment, this story will show us something even quieter, revealing the subtle transformation that began to reshape Yuto's relationship with his own flaws. "Look closer, Yuto," she said softly, her voice matching the dry rustle of the hemp leaves in the wind. She guided his hand down onto the surface of the woven fabric. Yuto pressed his fingers against the cloth. It was heavy, thick, and extraordinarily rough. His skin caught on the uneven ridges where the bulky slubs of the yarn had been woven across the vertical warp lines. It looked like a landscape of miniature mountains and valleys, completely lacking the glassy, reflective smoothness of the ceremonial robes he had been trained to value. "You are looking at this yarn through the eyes of a valley weaver who makes garments for summer courts," Auntie Chio said, her thumbs gently smoothing a rough patch of the hemp. "Down there they want everything to look like an unblemished sheet of ice because their lives are protected by high walls and soft fires. But up here on the ridge, the winter does not care about smooth patterns. When the blizzards arrive from the north, the wind cuts through fine silk like a knife through standing water." She leaned closer to the tallow candle, pointing out the microscopic spaces between the uneven threads. "Do you see these thick, heavy bumps? When we weave this irregular yarn, those bulky slubs do not ruin the cloth. They create millions of tiny, hidden pockets of air within the structure of the fabric, and those pockets are what trap the warmth of the body, creating a shield that no frost can ever penetrate. This rough, uneven hemp cloth is the only thing that can keep a human being alive when the mountain freezes. If I spent my days picking out every lump, trying to force this wild plant to become thin and uniform, the yarn would lose its inner resilience. It would snap on the loom, and the person wearing it would perish in the cold." Yuto sat perfectly still, his hand remaining flat against the rough winter cloth. The howling wind outside the stone hut seemed to echo the deep, sudden silence that was widening inside his own mind. He looked at the weighted clay spindle, and then at his own raw fingers, realizing that he had spent his entire life treating the irregular patches of his history as a fatal disaster. He had been operating under the illusion that unless the yarn of his life was perfectly smooth, uniform, and free of knots, it was entirely useless. He had been trying to turn his fluid, human journey into a piece of summer silk, completely blind to the fact that his rough edges, his periods of confusion, and the very mistakes he regretted were the things that had given his spirit its heavy, winter-ready durability. A subtle, real transformation began to unfold within Yuto's chest, not with a dramatic burst of enlightenment, but with a slow, quiet yielding to reality. He did not magically forget his past failures, and he did not instantly become a flawless master of his thoughts. But when the old defensive urge to judge the yarn arose in his mind, he chose to do something he had never done before. He took a long, deep breath before reacting. He sat with the uncertainty of the uneven thread, allowing the lumps and the thin spaces to exist on the spindle without immediately deciding that they were a sign of ruin. He reached out his hand, his movements slow and deliberate, and picked up a raw piece of uncombed hemp from the basket. For the first time, he did not look at the plant fiber with an eye of correction. He felt its coarse, unrefined texture between his fingers, accepting its nature exactly as it had grown out of the rocky mountain soil. He stopped treating the critical voices in his head as absolute statements of truth, recognizing that his overthinking was simply a clumsy, frightened child trying to protect him from a winter he was already fully equipped to survive. He leaned forward and gently helped Auntie Chio feed the raw hemp into the whirring clay spindle, his hands moving in a quiet, harmonious rhythm with the imperfect materials of the world. The soft, rhythmic whirring of Auntie Chio's weighted clay spindle gradually recedes into the background of the mountain night, leaving a vast, unhurried stillness that flows downward through the crags and enters the quiet perimeter of your own mind. The realization that settled into the young weaver Yuto as he touched that coarse, irregular winter cloth is a profound turning point in how we understand the architecture of our own suffering. He saw that the thick lumps and uneven ridges he had spent his life loathing were the very structures that trapped the air, creating a protective shield of warmth against the freezing blizzards of the peak. He stopped fighting the raw texture of the hemp because he realized that the demand for absolute smoothness would only make the fiber brittle and leave him completely exposed to the cold. Slowly, the teaching becomes personal, stepping out of the mountain hut and entering the immediate silent sanctuary of your own bedroom tonight. When we look beneath the surface of our overthinking, we begin to see the hidden psychological mechanism that keeps us awake, turning old choices over and over in our thoughts. For many of us, chronic self-judgment and regret are not random accidents, they are deeply ingrained habits born from a terrified desire for control. When we replay an old mistake, a failed relationship, or an hour of clumsiness, our mind is under the illusion that if it punishes us severely enough, it can somehow undo what has already been woven into the earth. We use shame as a crude tool for self-fixation, believing that if we refuse to forgive ourselves, we are somehow maintaining an honorable standard of goodness. This constant trial inside the mind is a desperate flight from the radical uncertainty of the present moment. We cling to our regrets because the past, even when it is painful, feels familiar and concrete, whereas the unwritten edge of today requires us to step forward without a guarantee of perfection. We turn our old wounds into a rigid identity, defining ourselves as the person who failed, the one who made the wrong choice, or the individual who is permanently behind the rhythm of life. We believe that by keeping our inner courtroom active, we are protecting ourselves from making the same mistake again. But this constant prying with the iron needle of self-criticism does not protect the heart. It only ensures that our present spirit remains raw, frayed, and completely frozen by fear. One of the great insights of the Buddha was that every human life is touched by two distinct types of pain, and our true liberation begins when we learn to distinguish between the two. The first pain is simply what life brings through our natural human limitations, the unevenness of the raw fiber. The moment of confusion where our clarity failed, the words spoken in a state of exhaustion, or the path we chose when our vision was clouded by old fears. This first pain is an inevitable condition of being a changing creature in a complicated world. The person you were when that old thread skipped was acting from a limited set of conditions, carrying burdens and missing insights that you possess right now. We cannot always control this first pain because we cannot live with flawless, infinite wisdom every second of our journey. The heddle of time strikes, and the roe is pressed flat into the base of our history. The true source of your midnight exhaustion tonight, however, is the second pain. The second pain is entirely what your own overthinking mind adds to the original irregularity through resistance and self-hatred. The first pain is the raw, uneven knot in the lower hem of your past. The second pain is the hours of agonizing rehearsal where you drive the iron needle into your own skin, convincing yourself that because your fabric has a knot, you are fundamentally ruined and undeserving of rest. The first pain is a skipped thread. The second pain is the ragged, chaotic tear you create in the day you are living right now by demanding that your history be flat and uniform like silk. We cannot alter the first pain after the loom has beaten it down, but we can completely choose to stop feeding the second. Peace, within gentle tradition of awareness, is never described as a magical state, where your past is completely rewritten, or where you become a perfect person who never experiences a moment of regret. True peace is simply a completely different relationship with your imperfections. It is the capacity to look at the uneven ridges of your history with an immense, non-judgmental softness, recognizing that those heavy slubs and bulky knots are the very places where your resilience was spun. It is the willingness to let the yarn be thick and raw, knowing that the warmth of your compassion can inhabit the irregularities without needing to tear the structure apart. When you stop demanding that your life be an unblemished monument, the tight restriction in your chest begins to yield to a vast, cool spaciousness. Right now, as you listen to the steady, unhurried rise and fall of your chest, you might notice how your mind reacts to this understanding. Maybe you feel a sudden wave of frustration because you cannot let go instantly, or perhaps your thoughts are already analyzing this insight, turning it into another standard of performance you must master to be okay. If that pattern is happening, meet that inner critic with an absolute soft patience. Even that self-blame is just the mind's old habit, trying to use force to manufacture serenity. You do not need to fix your reactions tonight, and you do not need to force your mind into an artificial state of silence. You are safe enough to let the yarn be uneven, safe enough to sit with the unfinished rows of your life, and permitted to rest deeply in the dark that has no demands on your perfection. Now, let this deep, textured wisdom travel all the way down from the freezing stone huts of the high crags directly into the ordinary, unvarnished spaces of your modern daily life. The exhausting habit of treating every irregularity as a disaster does not just happen at an ancient wooden loom, it replicates itself every single day within the quiet, digital environments of your afternoons and the heavy, restless hours of your midnight schedule. We live in an environment that constantly praises the illusion of smooth, unblemished silk, demanding that our careers look perfectly uniform, our relationships remain entirely free of knots, and our personal progress move along a straight, predictable line. When your reality does not match this artificial texture, the overthinking mind panics, picking frantically at your timeline, treating your natural human irregularities as proof that you are fundamentally insufficient. Think of how this pattern takes hold of your spirit in the small, seemingly unnoticed moments of a normal week. Perhaps you are lying in your bed right now, your face illuminated by the sharp blue light of a phone screen, waiting with a tight chest for a specific text message to arrive. In those long, agonizing minutes of silence, your mind handles that delayed notification exactly the way the young weaver handled the organic knots in his blanket. You seek that digital reassurance as a tool to fix your internal worry, believing that if the message finally appears, it will smooth out the uneven anxiety in your stomach. But if the screen stays dark, or if the response feels cold and brief, the old habit of self-blame awakens. You begin to replay an old mistake you made months ago, dragging your history back into the dark to find where you failed to keep the relationship perfectly flawless. Maybe you have felt this heavy friction during your working hours, walking through a crowded room, or sitting at a desk with a polite, capable smile fixed onto your face, while your spirit feels completely waterlogged and thin from pretending to be okay. You perform your duties with meticulous precision, comparing your internal chaos to the carefully ironed, public presentation of everyone around you. You look at the lives of others and conclude that their yarn is thin, elegant, and moving forward without a single hitch, while your own journey feels clumped, irregular, and permanently behind the rhythm of the world. When you finally close your door to find shelter at night, a subtle, bitter guilt prevents you from settling down. A voice whispers that you have no right to this stillness, that you have not achieved enough to earn your rest, and that you should be awake right now planning how to repair your flaws before the next sunrise. And perhaps this is where the teaching begins to touch your own heart in a practical, beautifully realistic way. True inner freedom is not something you achieve by escaping the modern world or by waiting until all your relationships are perfectly untangled. Peace is practiced in the tiny, uncelebrated gaps of an otherwise demanding day. It is the single deep breath you choose to take before typing a frantic, defensive response to someone whose judgment you fear. In that brief second of breathing, you are practicing a rare form of spiritual discipline. You are choosing to observe the hot, urgent impulse of your anxiety without giving it permission to command your fingers. You are allowing the moment to be uneven and raw without deciding that you must tear yourself apart to fix it. You can walk through your daily routine with the slow, spacious awareness that not every critical thought that crosses your mind deserves your obedience, and not every heavy feeling is an absolute command. When the old habit of overthinking arrives, when your mind begins to stage future arguments or count the years you feel you have lost, you can learn to meet those internal voices, the same way Auntie Chio met the wild, unrefined stalks of hemp. You can look at the worry and say to yourself with a quiet, internal softness, "Ah, there is the mind trying to turn an ordinary thought into an identity." You do not need to fight the thought, and you do not need to blame yourself for being anxious. You only need to let the thread slide through your awareness, without gripping it so tightly that your palms begin to bleed. You can care deeply about your path, your family, and your responsibilities without turning your own spirit into a sacrificial garment that must be ruined to keep others warm. When you release the impossible demand to have an unblemished history, your relationship with your daily life begins to soften. You stop looking at your setbacks as evidence of an unpardonable flaw, recognizing instead that those very disruptions, those very periods of confusion and grief, are creating the necessary air pockets within your character. They are the structures that give you the capacity to hold immense empathy for other hurting people, providing a heavy, winter-ready resilience that smooths out into true wisdom over time. Think of how much lighter your mornings would feel if you allowed your body to rest without demanding that it earn the right to exist. Rest is not a luxury you receive as a reward for a flawless performance. It is the very ground from which a healthy life is woven. It is an act of profound self-forgiveness to look at your unfinished projects, your complicated relationships, and your imperfect progress at the end of the day and say to yourself, "The rows I wove today are uneven. Some lines are thick and some are thin, but the cloth is complete for tonight, and the loom can sit in the dark." You can forgive yourself for the boundaries you had to set, knowing that you cannot create a durable tomorrow if you are constantly burning the foundation of today to satisfy your guilt. Tomorrow. When you find yourself caught in the old trap of checking your phone for reassurance, or when you feel that sudden, stinging shame of believing you are not enough, take a slow, unhurried breath. Remember that your life is not a commodity that must be uniform to be valuable. Like the heavy winter blanket formed on the mountain ridge, your presence is real, true, and protective, precisely because it has been formed by rough materials and unexpected turns of the shuttle. You can let go of the need to force every outcome to match your fears, allowing the tapestry of your days to unfold with its own natural variations, its own knots, and its own unique, beautiful texture. The high mountain winds have finally grown quiet along the granite ridges, leaving an absolute, unhurried silence to settle over the stone-walled hut and down into the immediate deep shadows of your own room. The heavy wooden beams of the loom have ceased their movement, and the weighted clay hand spindle has rested completely against the timber floorboards, its spinning cycle finished for the night. There is no uneven thread left for you to examine, no past mistake you are required to justify, and no jagged edge of your history that you must smooth out before morning. The great mountain terrace of the evening has wrapped your entire awareness in a soft white shroud of mist, inviting you to step completely away from the courtrooms of your memory and return home to the simple, unadorned sanctuary of your own physical presence. Listen closely to the slow, heavy cadence of your breathing as it moves through the quiet dark. The inhalation rises softly within your chest, like a gentle thread gliding through the warp, and the exhalation falls away without a single ounce of your own effort, letting the last mineral residues of the day's self-criticism dissolve into the cool night air. Your breath requires no performance from you tonight, no standard of perfection to meet, and no defense of your past choices. It is a natural, fluid movement of life, keeping you whole and grounded without asking for your permission or your constant anxiety. With every slow release of air, let your limbs sink just a fraction deeper into the mattress, allowing the tired muscles around your eyes to unclamp and permitting your jaw to drop completely into the cushioning support of your pillow. Let your imagination rest one final time upon that silent mountain ridge where the wild hemp grows in the rocky hollows. The small tallow candles have burned down to a soft, warm amber glow, casting long, peaceful shadows across the unspun fleece and the baskets of raw fiber. The heavy winter garment that Auntie Chia wove from the irregular yarn lies completely finished, resting quietly in the corner of the stone hut. The thick, bulky slabs and the uneven ridges that once caused the young weaver so much panic are no longer separate problems to be isolated and pulled apart with a sharp needle. They have become the very fabric itself, creating millions of tiny hidden pockets of air that trap the warmth, forming an unbreakable shield that keeps out the freezing mountain frost. The cloth does not apologize for its rough texture, and it does not try to rewrite the rose that came before. It simply rests in the quiet darkness, heavy, durable, and completely whole. The fabric of your own life is allowed to possess that same honest dignity tonight. The person who made those old choices in the lower rows of your history was operating under different conditions, carried by past fears, and lacking the clarity you hold within your chest right now. The heddle of reality has struck, and those threads have been pressed flat into the density of the earth, interlocking with 1,000 other moments to create the unique, winter-ready resilience of your spirit. You do not have to tear your present day apart to repair a skipped thread from years ago, and you do not need to build an identity around your failures. You can trust the weave of your life to hold you secure, recognizing that your value has never been defined by an absence of knots, but by the vast, compassionate space that allows the entire cloth to exist exactly as it fell. Take another slow, unhurried breath, letting the inhalation lift your abdomen like a quiet wave, and let the exhalation carry away the very last traces of your daily defenses. There is no trial taking place in this dark room, no ledger keeping track of your mistakes, and no requirement for you to figure out the path forward before morning. You are permitted to let the iron needle drop completely out of your thoughts, leaving it to rest in the shadows under the bench while your hands remain open and empty in the dark. You are safe enough to stop fighting the reality of your history, safe enough to leave your relationships and your projects unfinished in the loom of the world, and fully allowed to dissolve into the deep, unburdened sleep that requires no justification from your strength. The single, weightless strand of unspun silk drops gently onto the deep bed of damp forest moss outside the workshop, completely still, bearing no intricate pattern and holding no tension against the night. Your thoughts can mimic that same soft descent, losing their sharp analytical boundaries, becoming like loose wool resting quietly in a wicker basket after the spinning has ended. The internal critic has laid down its weapons. The courtroom of your memory has grown entirely dark, and the frantic urge to correct yourself has finally yielded to the deep, silent current of the present moment. Allow your body to flatten fully into the linen of your sheets, feeling heavier, softer, and more spacious with every passing second, drifting slowly toward a dreamless rest, where the desire to fix yesterday completely disappears into the quiet, dark water. What if the home you have been searching for all these years was never a perfect, unblemished fabric you had to weave, but simply the quiet, self-forgiving awareness that has been breathing beneath all your irregularities?